Every building, every religion, every empire, every company, every book, every child raised with care. What if all of it exists because the person who made it knew they were going to die? Not some of human culture, all of it. A watchmaker's son from Vienna made that claim first. Otto Rank, born there in 1884, one of 4 children, educated himself the way certain extraordinary minds do, ferociously, indiscriminately, long before any institution got hold of him. By his early 20s, he had read everything: Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, the classical myths, the German romantics. He sent an unsolicited manuscript to Sigmund Freud. Freud was impressed enough to take him on as a protege, make him secretary of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and place him within the innermost circle of the psychoanalytic movement. For years, Rank was Freud's most brilliant and most trusted colleague. And almost from the beginning, he was quietly developing an idea that would break with everything Freud believed. Freud held that the engine of the human mind was sexuality, that the energy behind repression, neuroses, religion, art was sexual energy redirected and transformed. Rank came to believe the engine was something else entirely, not sexuality, but mortality, not the drive to reproduce, but the terror of ending. In 1914, he published a short, strange book called Der Doppelgänger, The Double. It is one of the most original works of early psychoanalytic literature, and it turns out to be a key to a story written 4,000 years earlier. Rank traced the figure of the double, the shadow, the reflection, the twin, through folklore and literature, and argued that at its deepest level, it represents the externalized soul. In archaic cultures, the shadow and the reflection were understood as the part of a person that could survive death, the immortal component, projected outside the perishable body. This is why Rank argued ancient peoples made images of their gods, not for beauty, because the image was felt to contain something of the being it depicted, a fragment of soul that could outlast flesh. Then something changed. As individual self-awareness grew sharper and more bounded, the double turned threatening. It stopped being a guarantee of survival and became an omen of death. In the German Romantics, in Poe, in Dostoevsky, the double is the figure who appears just before the self is destroyed. It arrived as a promise of immortality and left as a messenger of the grave. Now hold that against the oldest story we have. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, is about a king of the city of Uruk who has everything and cannot accept that he will die. Early in the poem, the gods create a wild man named Enkidu as his counterweight, his equal in strength, his opposite in nature. They fight to a draw. They embrace. They become inseparable. Enkidu is, in Rank's sense, Gilgamesh's double, the externalized half of the self. And when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does not simply lose a friend, he loses his double, which, in Rank's framework, is the same as seeing your own death in a mirror. The king says it himself, "I too shall die. Shall I not be like Enkidu?" The self has just seen its own reflection lying in a corpse. Rank fled Europe in the 1930s as fascism rose and spent the last part of his career in the United States. His final works, Will Therapy in 1936 and Beyond Psychology, published after his death in 1941, describe a human being suspended between two terrors that are equally unbearable: the terror of dying and the terror of living fully, of being a complete, separate, unrepeatable individual, which means being one that ends. What Rank proposed was not a cure. He called it will,
the capacity to hold that tension without being torn apart by it, to affirm your own mortal individuality without denying either its wholeness or its limit. It is what a tightrope walker does. Balance is not stillness, it is continuous small correction against the pull on either side.
The man who would turn Rank's insight into the most important book of the century about human culture was, by then, still a boy. Ernest Becker was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. He served in the Second World War, which gave him an early and intimate acquaintance with mass death and with the mechanisms by which people go on functioning in its presence. He studied anthropology and psychology, taught at a series of American universities, and finally settled at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He was working against a clock, and he knew it. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer in 1972. You can feel the urgency on every page of the book he finished in that condition, The Denial of Death, published in January 1974. He died in March at 49. In April, it won the Pulitzer Prize. Becker's thesis is simple to state and very hard to escape. Awareness of death, he argued, is the primary source of human anguish. Not frustrated sexuality, not economic inequality, not the Oedipus complex, the plain knowledge, unique to our species, that we are going to die, that it is certain, and that nothing can be done about it. Held fully in mind, that knowledge would be unlivable. No creature could get out of bed, form attachments, or plan a year ahead in a state of constant, clear awareness of its own dissolution. So, Becker argued, culture steps in, all of it. Religion, politics, economics, art, the entire superstructure of civilization is, at its foundation, a defense system against the terror of death. He called the personal version of it the Immortality Project, or in the older Latin phrase, the causa sui project, cause of oneself, the attempt to become the author of your own existence and your own survival. Every human being builds one, consciously or not, a system of beliefs, memberships, and works that lets them feel part of something that will outlast their body. Religion is the most explicit form, a soul that survives, an afterlife that continues. But secular cultures build their own, and they are no less powerful. Building a company is an immortality project. Having children is an immortality project. Writing a book, achieving fame, belonging to a great nation, all immortality projects. Even joining a gym and sculpting a body that resists the visible signs of aging is one in Becker's framework. It is the same gesture as the king of Uruk putting on his finest robes after battle, not vanity, an assertion against perishability. And American culture, Becker argued, is the most elaborate and energetic immortality project civilization has ever produced. A culture of self-creation, of infinite possibility, of the refusal of given conditions, built on the conviction that any limit yields to enough effort, intelligence, or money. It has taken the terror of death and turned it into the most productive engine in history. Becker built on Rank, whom he named as his most important predecessor. He built on Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who lived from 1813 to 1855, and whose account of anxiety, the condition of a creature that is finite and aware of the infinite, anticipates Becker's own. And he built on Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1976, whose analysis of being toward death gave Becker the philosophical frame for a psychological claim. He also built, explicitly, on Gilgamesh. In The Denial of Death, the epic appears as the archetypal story of the Immortality Project, a man who tries every available form of transcendence in turn, heroic fame, the companionship of a second self, the literal pursuit of biological immortality, the memorialization of the dead, and who finds, only in the failure of all of them, the one form of peace available to a mortal being, acceptance of his death,
and the recognition that his works are his monument. In Becker's reading, Gilgamesh is not a failure. He is the first fully self-aware human being in literature, the first who confronted the terror of death without mythological protection, and who found on the far side of that confrontation a life worth living.
For 60 years, this was philosophy. Then somebody tested it in a laboratory. In the 1980s, 3 American social psychologists, Jeff Greenberg of the University of Arizona, Sheldon Solomon of Skidmore College, and Tom Piszczynski of the Colorado University, set out to check whether Becker was right experimentally. What they built over the following 30 years is called terror management theory. The design is elegant. Participants are split into 2 groups. One group is asked to think about their own death, to write briefly about what it feels like to contemplate it. The other group is asked to think about something unpleasant but not fatal. Then both groups complete tasks measuring their attitudes toward cultural groups, belief systems, and behaviors.
The results have been replicated hundreds of times across cultures and designs, and they are consistent. The people who are reminded of their own death become more strongly identified with their own group, more hostile to those who hold different values, more generous toward anyone who praises their worldview, more likely to spend conspicuously, more nationalistic, more religious, more willing to endorse aggressive responses to perceived threats.
Put plainly, remind a human being that they will die, and they tighten their grip on whatever makes them feel part of something permanent. Greenberg, Solomon, and Piszczynski published their synthesis in 2015 in a book called The Worm at the Core, on the Role of Death in Life. The title comes from the American philosopher William James, who described the worm at the core of all apparent human happiness, the awareness of death that eats quietly at the base of even our best moments, a crack invisible on the surface of a beam, widening underneath. Their work is the experimental confirmation of what Rank and Becker argued from philosophy and anthropology, and they named Gilgamesh directly, the first documented terror manager in human history, the first individual for whom we have written testimony of systematically managing the anguish of death by building projects of symbolic survival. Fame through heroic enterprise, then memorial art for a dead friend, then the literal search for biological immortality, and finally, at the end, the recognition that the text and the walls are monument enough.
There is a harder version of this argument, and it came earlier. The American philosopher Norman O. Brown published Life Against Death in 1959, and it contains the sharpest critique of the Immortality project as a cultural sickness. Brown argued that a capitalist economy is, at its psychological foundation, a system of compulsive accumulation, and that compulsive accumulation is driven by an unconscious fantasy of defeating death through infinite acquisition of goods, wealth, and power. The accumulator, in Brown's analysis, is Gilgamesh in a suit. He does not gather more because he needs more. He gathers because stopping would mean facing the emptiness the gathering conceals. The work is never finished because finishing would require confronting death. The company is never large enough. The net worth is never sufficient. There is always another quarter, another market, another frontier.
Brown's proposed remedy, a return to the body, to present pleasure, to the acceptance of mortality, is, almost word for word, the advice a tavern keeper gives Gilgamesh at the edge of the world in the ancient poem. Stop searching, eat, drink, hold the hand of the person you love, and let that be enough. And it runs into the same wall. A culture built on the productive denial of death cannot easily hear advice that requires it to stop. Which brings this back to you, sitting there with your own projects. The point of all this is not that ambition is a neurosis or that building things is a symptom. Rank, Becker, Brown, and 30 years of laboratory data are not telling you to want less. They are telling you something more useful and more uncomfortable. That you already know what you are doing, and you have arranged your life so that you never have to say it out loud. The promotion you are chasing, the house, the follower count,
the book you keep meaning to write, the body you are trying to hold in place against time. None of those are foolish. They are how a conscious animal keeps functioning while carrying an impossible piece of information.
The question the oldest story in the world puts to you is not whether to stop building. Gilgamesh built. The walls of Uruk were real, and the poem about them outlasted the man, the city, and the empire that followed it. The question is whether you know why you are building, and whether when the thing is finished, you will be able to look at it and let it be enough. That is what the king finally did. Empty-handed, having failed at everything he set out to do, he came home, climbed his own wall, looked at what he had made, and stopped running. 4,000 years later, nobody has produced a better answer. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And let me know in the comments what you think. It helps me figure out what to cover next.